Let's hear what the Sinn Féin President, Mary Lou McDonald, thinks. She joins me now live from Dublin. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Nationalists won more votes than unionist parties 10 days ago, but of course neither side has an overall majority. Do you accept the conditions for calling a border poll have not yet been met?
Well, I've said to you many times, Mark, and more importantly, perhaps I've shared the view with the Taoiseach, with successive Taoiseach, that we need to begin preparations now. We're not going to head into a referendum without having had a very broad-based conversation, discussion and planning. And I think the election, which was historic, another historic first, demonstrates again that change is underway, that change is happening, that the pace of it is quite rapid, and that we need to talk to each other, we need to prepare, and we need to grasp the incredible opportunities that lie ahead for all of us that live on this island. So that, for me, is the absolute priority now, and the government in Dublin needs to lead in this regard. We have said many times that it's now the time to call a citizens' assembly, to bring together a space, a recognised formal space for these conversations and exchanges to take place from stakeholders right across Irish society, north and south, east and west.
We don't, of course, know what the criteria are at this stage. We know what the Good Friday Agreement says. You've got someone now like Sir John Major, former British Conservative Prime Minister, saying it is time for us to know precisely where the bar is and what it looks like. Do you have a clear idea in your mind where that bar is?
Well, look, I agree with John Major, and in fact, this is something that Sinn Féin has raised with successive Prime Ministers, that needs to be set out very, very clearly. Thus far, the British government has flatly refused to share with us what they believe would be the moment that a referendum might be triggered. But I think John Major is correct, on the back now of two very, very significant elections with an eye to the change that's happening. And it's quite profound, I think, right across Irish society and in the north, that they should set out those that criteria now. I would urge them to do so. And I think that would give a level of clarity and some shape to the wider conversation. But let me be clear, even if the British government continues to dodge this issue, even if they maintain the position of saying we don't have to set out the criteria, that should not stop the rest of us doing what needs to be done. Because let me say, Mark, you know, there will be no prizes for those who buried their head in the sand. Change is happening. It is absolutely critically important that it's managed in an orderly and an inclusive and a respectful way.
OK, but it's interesting you say change is happening. It is arguable, is it not, that change is happening at a snail's pace. The combined nationalist vote, including People Before Profit and independent nationalists 10 days ago, is 43.5%, according to the respected data analyst Peter Donaghy. The combined unionist vote is 39.4%. So that does not suggest a majority of people would vote for constitutional change as things currently stand. So I'm just going to ask you again, what do you think the criteria should be? What elections should we be taking into account, and over how long a sustained period, for us to know that a border poll might be appropriate and people would vote for change?
Well, look, we're 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, and of course this central component of that is provision for a referendum, for a border poll. So the time is now, is the answer to your question, and you'll have heard me say many, many times that these referendums will happen in the course of this decade. I can't give you a precise date at this juncture. What I can say to you is that the preparation for those referendums needs to get underway now. There is an urgency around that. And just remember, Mark, whatever way the numbers are crunched and the data is analysed, Sinn Féin in the election scored an historic first, the largest local mandate ever secured by any political party in the north since the 1970s. So to try and play that down, to try and play down the emergence of the other space in northern politics, to try and play down the very significant social changes and demographic changes that are underway, I think is a mistake. And remember this also, people understandably will focus on the question of the ending of partition, of reunification, of a new Ireland, when we start to flesh out exactly what that means, and when people understand very fully that they're not spectators, that everybody, all of us, every section of our people will have a hand in designing and deciding what that new Ireland looks like.
You will know very well the Good Friday Agreement says the Secretary of State shall call a border poll if at any time it appears likely to him, or presumably her, that a majority of those voting would express a wish that Northern Ireland should cease to be part of the United Kingdom and form part of a united Ireland. And I'm simply saying to you that if you look at the combined nationalist vote last time round at 43.5%, you are nowhere near clearing the bar of 50% plus one.
But equally, can I say to you that those who would argue for the maintenance of the union are well below, fall well short of that 50% threshold.
Well,
so in the numbers, if you want. Well, exactly. Well, you're making my point for me. That's precisely the point. So in terms of the data and the stats, I mean, arguably we are at the point now in these times where the calling of referendums will not only be defensible but absolutely necessary. But the reality of this, because this has to work for everybody, this is about a win for everybody on this island. The reality is that we will not go to the polls on a referendum in the absence of engagement, preparation and planning. We saw how that worked out for our neighbours across the water in the Brexit context. We will not be so foolish as to make that mistake again. I want everybody to be involved and have a stake in all of this. And that's the important work that needs to happen now.
Do you think it was a failure of nationalism on reflection, just briefly, to fail to nail down the clear specifics of the terms that need to be met when the Good Friday Agreement was being negotiated 25 years ago?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think when that agreement was struck, it was a whole series of strategic compromises and accommodations that made that agreement possible. And at that point in time, I think the best bargain that could be struck was struck on this. The central point is that it is for the Irish people, for all of us on this island who share this place as home, to decide our future together by means of a referendum. And those referendums will happen. They will happen in the coming years. There's no doubt in my mind about that. What I am doubtful about is the capacity now of the current government in Dublin and the government in London to be alive and aware of and responsive to the extent of the change and simply to make preparations for it. Nobody should be afraid of this conversation. This is about opportunity. We all need to be involved, and the governments, particularly in Dublin, need to lead in that regard.
Well, it's pretty obvious that the current Taoiseach Leo Varadkar doesn't share your view, because he was talking to the Irish Times yesterday and he said very clearly the conditions for a border poll are not right. He said the push for a border poll, I think, is counterproductive. What we need to do is to make the Good Friday Agreement work, get the Assembly, the Executive, the North, South and East-West bodies functioning well, and then have the conversation between the governments and with the parties about what changes we might be able to make. So he's not on the same page as you at the moment. He's the Taoiseach, you're not.
Well, that is the case, and he is on the wrong page. I mean, we all know, we know full well that we need the executive back up and running. We need a functioning assembly. We need the East-West institutions to work. We need the North-South piece to work as well. And you can do all of those things and at the same time have the kind of engagement and planning that I'm describing. The political system and political leaders have to have a capacity to multitask and do several things, several important critical things at the same time. So I think to advance an argument that we will not prepare for the medium and long-term future simply because we have challenges in the present. That doesn't stack up. That's not responsible politics, in my view.
There are a couple of other issues I want to talk to you about as well. So just briefly on this, staying with the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, he also told the Irish Times yesterday that the Republic could co-fund some projects here in Northern Ireland because that might help the situation in the north where there's a real budget squeeze. And he cited the co-funding of the A5 road to Derry as an example. Do you agree with him, I wonder? And should other projects, perhaps like Casement Park, be considered as well?
Well, I think firstly we need to confront the fact that the British state, the Tory government, consistently fails to fund the North correctly. I think we also have to confront the fact that the necessary fiscal powers that the executive needs to really operate at full tilt have not been devolved. We need to collectively recognise that reliance on a block grant in the medium and long term is not the way that we're going to build a thriving economy and strong public services. And that brings us back to the conversation that we've had around unity and the new Ireland. But as regards Dublin, certainly the Exchequer the coffers are full. We're running record surpluses here. We need to invest that money very smartly, and infrastructure is the smart investment. And certainly as regards the A5, the fact that we're still talking about this project so many years on tells its own story. Investment in infrastructural projects on an all-island basis is the right way to go. The northwest in particular, Derry, Donegal, Strabane, that all of that area has been left behind, north of or west of the Shannon equally. So we need a thoughtful, joined-up plan as to how monies are invested for the future. And certainly you won't be surprised to hear that we are very open to Dublin being an active partner in these big infrastructural projects. But let me say this, that does not take for a second the obligation on the British government, the Tory government, to step up to the plate, to reverse the real damage that will be done by their budget. We're looking at market services, some of them closing at the end of June, and yet we're hearing nonsense from people suggesting that perhaps we might have an executive back up and running in the autumn time. That to me is utterly farcical and completely unacceptable.
One last question about something which broke just this morning, if you don't mind. The NIO Minister, Lord Kane, has said planned changes to the government's legacy proposals would ensure the new system is more robustly compliant, as he put it, with international law and more acceptable to victims. Has Sinn Féin been made aware of what those proposed changes look like?
No, we haven't. And it's hard to see. It's hard to see how this legislation could be amended to make it compliant with human rights standards and international law. I think it's unamendable. So if government is serious about actually having a system that works, that meets the needs of victims and survivors from all sides, that's human rights compliant with international law, then they need to withdraw this legislation and return back to the original Stormont House framework and agreement.